The delicate clink of crystal against crystal echoed through the sunlit dining room, as Richard's brother, Victor, set down his champagne flute with deliberate precision. His lips curled into what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. Sarah sat across from him at the mahogany table that had once belonged to her late husband, her posture perfectly straight, her expression carefully neutral despite the storm brewing inside her. The tension between them had been building for months since Richard's funeral, but today it had reached its breaking point. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let's not pretend anymore, Sarah, Victor said, his voice smooth as polished marble. We both know you don't deserve a controlling share of the family business. You were just a trophy wife who got lucky with the timing. Sarah didn't flinch. She'd anticipated this confrontation since the reading of Richard's will 6 weeks ago. She merely took a slow sip of her water, set the glass down with steady hands, and met Victor's gaze directly. Funny, she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. That's exactly what your banker said when I finalized the purchase of Vertex Holdings last week. He couldn't believe the trophy wife now owns the parent company of your precious tech firm. The color drained from Victor's face, his carefully constructed facade crumbling in an instant. The silence that followed was deafening, a perfect counterpoint to the thunderous revelation that had just changed everything. Before we continue, this story of inheritance, betrayal, and unexpected power shifts, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling stories of resilience and justice. Sarah Mitchell had never planned to become the unexpected owner of a business empire at 45. For most of her adult life, she had been known, primarily as Richard Harrington's wife, elegant, diplomatic, the perfect hostess for his corporate events. What few people realized was that beneath her polished exterior lay the mind of a strategic thinker who had spent 15 years absorbing every nuance of her husband's business, while the men in tailored suits dismissed her as mere decoration. She met Richard when she was 30, working as a financial analyst at a boutique investment firm. He was 15 years her senior, already established as the CEO of Harrington Enterprises, a mid-sized manufacturing company he'd inherited from his father. Their first encounter had been purely professional, Sarah providing consultation on a potential acquisition. Richard had been impressed by her sharp insights and meticulous research. The business relationship evolved into coffee meetings, then dinners, then a whirlwind romance that surprised them both. From the beginning, Victor had made his disapproval clear. At their engagement party, he'd cornered Sarah by the bar, crystal, tumbler of whiskey in hand. Quite the career move, he'd said, eyes narrowed. From number cruncher to future Mrs. Harrington in under 6 months. Sarah had simply smiled. I'll take that as congratulations, Victor. She'd learned early that maintaining dignity was more powerful than defending herself against petty attacks. The wedding was intimate but elegant, held at Richard's lake house with just 60 guests. Victor had given a toast that walked the fine line between brotherly teasing and subtle undermining, comments about Richard's sudden decision, and references to Sarah's miraculous timing in meeting his recently divorced brother. Richard either didn't notice the barbs or chose to ignore them, squeezing Sarah's hand under the table as Victor raised his glass with a practiced smile. In those early years, Sarah had tried to build a relationship with her brother-in-law. She sent thoughtful birthday gifts, invited him to dinners, showed genuine interest in his tech startup, Innovatech Solutions. But Victor's responses remained coolly polite at best, openly dismissive at worst. When Sarah offered business suggestions, during family discussions, Victor would wait for her to finish speaking, then turn to Richard as if she hadn't said a word. "What do you think, Rich?" he would ask, effectively erasing her contribution. Richard would sometimes catch this dynamic and redirect. Actually, Sarah's point about the Asian market expansion makes sense. Let's explore that further. Other times he missed it entirely, absorbed in his own thoughts or distracted by business concerns. Despite Victor's behavior, Sarah found genuine fulfillment in her marriage. Richard respected her intelligence, frequently discussing business strategies, over breakfast or while walking their golden retriever Max around the neighborhood. He introduced her to industry contacts as my wife, Sarah, the smartest person in the room. When she expressed interest in understanding more about Harrington Enterprises, he gave her full access to company reports and invited her to sit in on-board meetings. "You have a better eye for details than anyone I know," Richard told her one evening as they reviewed quarterly projections on their patio. "I trust your judgment." This trust evolved into a partnership. Though Sarah never took an official position at Harrington Enterprises, preferring to maintain her role at the investment firm before eventually transitioning to nonprofit work, she became Richard's most valued advisor behind the scenes. Her financial acumen helped the company weather the 2008 recession with minimal damage. Her suggestion to diversify into sustainable materials proved prescient as environmental regulations tightened across multiple industries. Victor watched this developing influence with growing resentment. At family gatherings, he would make pointed comments about keeping business in the family and the importance of experienced leadership. When his own company, Innovatech, began struggling with cash flow issues 5 years ago, he approached Richard for investment but insisted that any discussions remain between brothers. Richard, however, shared everything with Sarah. "Victor's company has potential," he told her as they reviewed Innovatech's prospectus in bed one night. "But his management is chaotic, and he's hemorrhaging talent." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sarah nodded, pointing to a section of the financial statements. "He's also overpaying for administrative overhead, while underfunding R&D. That's backward for a tech company hoping to stay competitive." After several late-night discussions, Richard and Sarah agreed that Harrington Enterprises would invest in Innovatech, but with conditions: a restructured management team, better compensation for key engineers, and quarterly reviews of progress. Victor balked initially, but ultimately accepted the terms when no other investors emerged. What Victor never knew was that Sarah had personally directed a significant portion of her own savings into Innovatech through a separate investment vehicle. She believed in the company's core technology, despite its leadership problems. This silent investment, managed through a holding company she'd established years earlier called Meridian Partners, remained her private business decision, one of the few aspects of her financial life she kept separate from her shared portfolio with Richard. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Richard's work often took him away for days at a time, and his intense focus on business sometimes made him emotionally distant. Sarah had learned to navigate these periods, building her own fulfilling life through her nonprofit work, supporting women entrepreneurs in developing countries. They had decided early on not to have children, a choice that occasionally resurfaced in quiet moments of reflection, but never as regret. Last winter, everything changed. Richard's persistent cough, initially dismissed as seasonal allergies, was diagnosed as stage 4 lung cancer. The prognosis was grim, 6 months at best. Sarah's world tilted on its axis, but she approached this challenge as she did everything else, with clear-eyed determination and unflinching support. The day of the diagnosis, they sat together in their garden, hands intertwined as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. "I need to get things in order," Richard said, his voice already weaker than it had been just weeks before. "We will," Sarah promised. "Whatever you need." What followed were months of doctor appointments, legal meetings, and painful decisions. Richard insisted on continuing to work as long as his strength allowed, video conferencing into board meetings. From his home office, even as the disease ravaged his body, Sarah coordinated his care, managed his medications, and continued to discuss business strategies during his more lucid moments. Throughout this period, Victor's visits were infrequent and brief. He seemed uncomfortable with his brother's physical decline, often standing awkwardly by the door during family gatherings, checking his phone or making excuses to leave early. When he did engage, the conversations inevitably turned to the future of Harrington Enterprises. "Have you updated your succession plan?" Victor asked during one such visit, while Richard rested in the next room. "The board will need clear direction." Sarah had fixed him with a steady gaze. "Richard is handling everything exactly as he sees fit," she said quietly. "This isn't the time for corporate politics." Victor's expression had hardened. "With all due respect, Sarah, this is precisely the time. We're talking about a family legacy here, one that predates your arrival." She had simply turned away, unwilling to engage in conflict while her husband fought for each precious day. In Richard's final weeks, he and Sarah had several intense conversations about the future. "Victor expects to take control," Richard said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper as he lay propped against pillows in their bedroom. "He's been positioning himself with the board for months." Sarah nodded. "I know. But he doesn't understand our vision for the company. He's too focused on short-term gains, too willing to sacrifice the corporate culture we've built." Richard reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I've made my decision, Sarah. The lawyers have everything. Promise me you'll see it through." "I promise," she had said, kissing his papery knuckles. "Rest now." Richard died peacefully. 3 days later, with Sarah by his side. The funeral was a dignified affair attended by hundreds, business associates, employees, friends, and family. Sarah stood stoically as person after person offered condolences, many whispering how Richard had spoken so highly of her, how he had credited her with much of his success in recent years. Victor had delivered a eulogy that painted his brother as a traditional business titan, emphasizing his old-school values and family-first mentality. It was a portrait that subtly positioned Victor as the natural heir to Richard's legacy, one that conveniently omitted Sarah's significance in his brother's life and work. The reading of the will a week later shattered that carefully constructed narrative. Richard had left controlling interest in Harrington Enterprises to Sarah, with specific instructions about maintaining the company's ethical commitments and employee-focused policies. He had appointed 2 longtime board members as co-trustees to assist her during the transition, but the message was unmistakable. Sarah was now at the helm. Victor's reaction had been immediate and volcanic. In the lawyer's office, he had stood abruptly, face flushed with anger. "This is absurd," he had sputtered. "She knows nothing about running a company of this size. This will destroy everything our family built." Sarah had remained seated, hands folded in her lap, as Victor continued his tirade about gold diggers and manipulation, until the family attorney firmly asked him to compose himself or leave the premises. In the 6 weeks since that day, Victor had launched a multi-pronged attack, calling emergency board meetings to question Sarah's qualifications, speaking to business reporters about his concerns for the company's future, and even reaching out to Richard's first wife to explore possible legal challenges to the will. Sarah had weathered it all with the same quiet dignity she had always shown, attending every board meeting thoroughly prepared, addressing concerns directly, and demonstrating a depth of knowledge about Harrington Enterprises that surprised even longtime executives. But she had also been making moves of her own, discreet, strategic decisions that Victor, in his arrogance, never thought to monitor. Which brought them to today's confrontation, in the dining room of what Victor still thought of as Richard's house, though it now belonged solely to Sarah. Victor had requested this meeting, ostensibly to find common ground for the sake of Richard's memory. Sarah had agreed, knowing exactly what was coming. After his initial shock at her revelation about Vertex Holdings, Victor recovered enough to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "That's impossible. Vertex is privately held by the Lowell family. They would never sell to an outsider." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Marion Lowell and I serve on the same nonprofit board. We've been discussing this transaction for nearly a year. Richard knew about it. In fact, he encouraged it. The final paperwork was signed last Tuesday." "You're bluffing," Victor said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Sarah reached into the folder beside her plate and slid a document across the table. "The ownership transfer is complete. Vertex Holdings now belongs to Meridian Partners, which belongs to me. And since Vertex is the majority shareholder in Innovatech Solutions." She let the implication hang in the air between them. Victor snatched up the document, scanning it with increasingly frantic eyes. You can't—" He looked up, his composed facade completely shattered. "You planned this. All of it." "No, Victor. I protected my husband's legacy and my own future. Something you forced me to do through your relentless attempts to push me out." Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath her words. "Did you really think I spent 15 years by Richard's side without learning anything? Or that I would simply step aside because you decided I didn't belong?" Victor pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "The board won't stand for this hostile maneuvering." "The board approved the acquisition yesterday," Sarah replied. "Unlike you, they've come to respect my business acumen. But don't worry, I have no intention of dismantling Innovatech. The technology is sound. It's the leadership that needs restructuring." As the full implications of his situation dawned on him, Victor's expression shifted from anger to something approaching fear. For the first time, he was seeing Sarah, really seeing her, not as his brother's decorative wife, but as a formidable strategic opponent who had outmaneuvered him at every turn. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. Sarah folded her hands on the table, meeting his gaze directly. "I want what Richard wanted, for both companies to thrive ethically and sustainably. You have technical expertise that's valuable, Victor. You could continue to play an important role, but not as CEO, and certainly not with your current approach to leadership." Victor's laugh was bitter. "So I'm supposed to work for my sister-in-law now? Take orders from Richard's widow?" "You're supposed to honor your brother's vision and contribute your talents appropriately," Sarah corrected him. "But whether you choose to do so is entirely up to you. The companies will move forward either way." In that moment, the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 15 years inverted completely. Victor, who had dismissed, undermined, and belittled Sarah at every opportunity, now found himself dependent on her goodwill for his professional future. Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced poise. "Take some time to think about it. My assistant will contact yours tomorrow to schedule a formal meeting at Harrington Enterprises to discuss your options." She gathered her folder and moved toward the door, pausing briefly. "For what it's worth, Victor, Richard always believed you had potential. He just thought you needed better guidance." With that, she walked out, leaving Victor alone in the dining room that now symbolized everything he had lost through his own arrogance and misjudgment. As she stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The confrontation she had been preparing for since Richard's diagnosis was finally behind her. Now the real work could begin. In the car, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Richard would have handled things differently, with more warmth perhaps, more willingness to smooth over conflict. But Richard had never had to fight for his place at the table the way she had. He had never been underestimated and dismissed simply because of who he was. Sarah started the engine, glancing briefly at the house in her rearview mirror. This victory wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about claiming the respect she had earned through years of quiet competence and unseen contribution. It was about honoring Richard's faith in her abilities. And perhaps most importantly, it was about finally stepping fully into her own power, not as Richard Harrington's widow, but as Sarah Mitchell, a force to be reckoned with in her own right. As she pulled away from the curb, Sarah felt a curious sense of liberation. The path ahead would not be easy. Corporate leadership never was, especially for women. But for the first time since Richard's death, she felt something like optimism stirring within her. She had survived Victor's worst attacks. She had protected what mattered. And in doing so, she had discovered strengths she hadn't fully recognized in herself. The confrontation with Victor marked not an ending, but a beginning. Sarah Mitchell was just getting started. Sarah Mitchell hadn't always been the confident woman who could face down Victor Harrington across a dining room table. Her journey to that moment had begun 30 years earlier in a small Pennsylvania town, where her father ran the local hardware store and her mother taught third grade. From childhood, Sarah had shown an unusual aptitude for numbers and patterns. While other kids struggled with math homework, she found elegant solutions that sometimes surprised even her teachers. "You have a gift," her high school calculus teacher had told her. "Don't waste it." She hadn't intended to. With scholarships and part-time jobs, Sarah put herself through Penn State, graduating with honors in finance. Her parents beamed with pride at her graduation, her father pressing a small velvet box into her hand afterward. "It was your grandmother's," he said, as Sarah opened it to reveal a delicate silver watch. "She always said time was the most valuable thing you could spend. Thought you should have it now that you're starting your career." That watch became Sarah's talisman, a reminder that every minute mattered as she navigated the male-dominated world of finance in the early 2000s. Her first job at Global Investment Partners taught her valuable lessons about resilience. The casual sexism was relentless, from being asked to take notes in meetings despite her analyst position to watching male colleagues with inferior performance records receive promotions she'd been denied. "It's not personal, Mitchell," her first boss had told her during a particularly disappointing performance review. "Clients just feel more comfortable with men handling their money. That's just how this industry works." Sarah hadn't argued. Instead, she had meticulously documented her performance metrics, built her own client relationships after hours, and created a portfolio of investment recommendations that consistently outperformed her peers. When she finally left Global for the boutique firm where she would eventually meet Richard, she did so with a client list that generated over $2 million in annual fees, 3 times what any other junior analyst had managed. Her new position at Ardent Capital allowed Sarah's analytical talents to flourish. The smaller firm valued performance over politics, and Sarah quickly established herself as someone who could spot investment opportunities others missed. It was this reputation that brought Richard Harrington to her desk one Tuesday morning. In autumn. "Mr. Harrington is considering acquiring Suntech Manufacturing," her manager had explained. "I told him you're the best person to analyze the financials." Sarah had approached the assignment with her characteristic thoroughness, working late into the night reviewing Suntech's books, researching their market position, and building complex financial models to test various acquisition scenarios. When she presented her findings to Richard 3 days later, she didn't just offer numbers. She provided context, highlighting potential integration challenges and suggesting alternative approaches that might yield better long-term results. Richard had listened intently, asking sharp questions that Sarah answered without hesitation. At the end of the meeting, he'd closed his notebook and given her a thoughtful look. "Most analysts tell me what I want to hear," he said. "You just told me what I needed to know. Thank you for saving me from an expensive mistake." Instead of acquiring Suntech, Richard had followed Sarah's suggestion to pursue a strategic partnership instead, a decision that ultimately benefited both companies and cemented her reputation at the firm. Richard began requesting Sarah for other projects, their professional relationship developing a comfortable rhythm. He respected her analytical mind, She appreciated his willingness to consider unconventional approaches. Their transition from business associates to something more personal happened gradually. Coffee meetings to discuss investment strategies extended into conversations about books, travel, and philosophy. Richard mentioned his recent divorce, a mutual decision after years of growing apart, and Sarah shared stories about her small-town upbringing. They discovered shared values despite their different backgrounds, a belief in meritocracy, a commitment to ethical business practices, and a surprisingly similar sense of humor. Their first non-business dinner happened almost accidentally. A late meeting about a potential new venture ran long, and Richard suggested they continue the discussion over food. "There's a great little Italian place around the corner," he'd said, "unless you have other plans." Sarah hadn't, and that simple dinner, where they talked about everything except business, shifted something between them. Richard was 15, years her senior, but Sarah found his perspective refreshing. Unlike the aggressive young bankers she typically encountered, Richard had nothing to prove. He listened more than he spoke, valued substance over showmanship, and treated staff with genuine kindness, small details that Sarah noticed and appreciated. 3 months later, Richard asked her to accompany him to a charity gala. It was their first public appearance as a couple, and Sarah still remembered the flutter of nervousness she'd felt as they entered the ballroom together. Richard had sensed her tension and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just be yourself," he'd whispered. "That's who I want beside me." It was at this event that Sarah first encountered Victor Harrington. While Richard stepped away to greet a business associate, his younger brother approached Sarah with a champagne flute and a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So you're my brother's new consultant," he'd said, emphasizing the last word just enough to make it sound suggestive. Sarah had maintained her composure. "I'm a financial analyst at Ardent Capital," she corrected him pleasantly. "Your brother and I have worked on several projects together." Victor's smile had tightened. "Yes, I'm sure you've been very thorough in your analysis." He'd glanced around the room. Richard has always had a soft spot for taking on projects after his divorce, though you're certainly prettier than his usual business ventures. Before Sarah could respond, Richard had returned, placing a protective hand at the small of her back. Something in his posture, a subtle straightening of his spine, a slight edge to his smile, suggested he had overheard at least part of the exchange. "I see you've met Sarah," Richard said to his brother. "She just saved Harrington Enterprises about $12 million by identifying problems in the Suntech acquisition that our entire financial team missed." Victor had raised his glass in a mock toast. "Impressive, though I'm sure she has many talents beyond finance." Richard's jaw had tightened, but Sarah spoke before he could. "Actually, finance is where my passion lies, Victor. There's something deeply satisfying about numbers. They don't posture or play games. They simply reveal truth to those who know how to read them." It was a gentle rebuke, delivered with a smile, but Victor's expression had hardened momentarily before he excused himself to mingle with other guests. That brief interaction set the tone for what would become years of subtle hostility from Richard's younger brother. Later that night, after the gala, Richard had apologized for Victor's behavior. "He's always been competitive with me," he explained as they shared a nightcap in the quiet corner of a hotel bar. "When our father put me in charge of the company, instead of him, it just made it worse." "You don't need to apologize for him," Sarah had said. "But I am curious. Why did your father choose you over Victor if he's so concerned about family legacy?" Richard had sighed, twirling the ice in his glass. "My father believed business leadership was about judgment, not just intelligence. Victor is brilliant, graduated top of his class at Wharton, has an IQ that would intimidate most people. But he makes decisions from ego rather than wisdom." He'd looked up at Sarah with a sad smile. "Dad told me once that Victor sees people as either tools or obstacles. That's no way to build something lasting. That insight into Victor had helped Sarah navigate his hostility during the early years of her relationship with Richard. She understood that his antagonism wasn't really about her. She was simply a convenient target for resentments that had festered long before she entered the picture. When Richard proposed 6 months later, it wasn't with a grand gesture, but during a quiet moment as they walked along the riverfront near his home. "I never expected to find you," he'd said, stopping to face her as the setting sun painted the water gold. "But now I can't imagine my life without your perspective, your integrity, your mind." He'd taken a small box from his pocket. "Sarah Mitchell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, my partner, my compass?" The ring had been his grandmother's, a vintage emerald-cut diamond in a platinum setting. Simple, elegant, with history behind it. Sarah had said yes without hesitation, not because Richard was wealthy or successful, but because in him she had found something rare. A man who saw her completely and valued what he saw. Their wedding plans had triggered Victor's first truly overt attempt at sabotage. 2 weeks after their engagement announcement, Richard received an anonymous envelope containing photos of Sarah having lunch with a younger man, their body language suggesting intimacy. Victor had made sure the envelope arrived while Sarah was present, his timing meticulous as always. Richard had opened it with Sarah beside him, both of them staring at the photos in confusion before Sarah burst into surprised laughter. "That's my cousin Michael," she'd explained, pointing to a detail the photographer had missed, the family resemblance visible in their identical smiles. "He was visiting from Chicago last month. We had lunch at that cafe near my office." Richard had studied the photos more carefully, then met her eyes. "There was never a doubt in my mind," he'd said simply, dropping the pictures into the trash. Later that evening, Richard had confronted Victor during what was supposed to be a celebratory family dinner. Sarah never learned exactly what was said between the brothers in Richard's study, but Victor's demeanor had shifted afterward, his hostility becoming less overt, more carefully disguised behind polite smiles and formal cordiality. The wedding itself was everything Sarah had wanted. Intimate, meaningful, focused on their commitment rather than spectacle. They wrote their own vows, Richard promising to honor your independence even as we build our life together. Sarah, pledging to be your partner in all things, your safe harbor in storms, your compass when paths seem unclear. Victor had delivered his best man's speech with practiced charm, raising his glass to my brother's happiness while his eyes remained cold. Only those who knew him well would have caught the subtle barbs woven through his seemingly affectionate anecdotes, references to Richard's impulsive nature and how the third time might be the charm for his brother's marital success. The early years of their marriage had been a careful balancing act for Sarah. She continued her career at Ardent Capital, building a reputation as one of their top analysts, while also adapting to life as the wife of a prominent business leader. There were expectations, charity boards, social events, corporate functions, that sometimes pulled her away from the work she loved, but Richard never pressured her to conform to any predetermined role. "My mother was miserable as a corporate wife," he told her once. "She gave up a promising career as an architect to host dinner parties and manage household staff. I watched her disappear a little more each year. I never want that for you." Sarah appreciated his support, but still found herself navigating complicated, social waters. Other executives' wives often treated her with polite bewilderment, unsure what to make of a woman who discussed market trends instead of interior decorators. Some of Richard's business associates subtly directed their comments to him, even when responding to questions she had asked. And always, there was Victor, watching from the periphery with that calculating gaze, waiting for her to make a misstep. "Why does it matter so much to him?" she asked Richard one night after a particularly tense family dinner, where Victor had spent the evening subtly undermining her contributions to the conversation. What does he think I'm going to do to his precious family name? Richard had considered the question carefully. Victor believes in a very specific kind of power, the kind our father wielded, the kind that's passed from father to son, the kind that stays within bloodlines. You represent a different kind of meritocracy, success based on skill rather than inheritance. In some ways, you embody everything that threatens his worldview. That conversation had helped Sarah understand the deeper currents in the Harrington family dynamics. Richard and Victor weren't just brothers with different personalities. They represented competing visions for the future of their family's legacy. Richard saw the potential for evolution and growth. Victor clung to tradition and hierarchy. Despite these tensions, Sarah found genuine fulfillment in her dual life. Her career continued to advance. She was made partner at Ardent Capital 5. Years into her marriage, while her relationship with Richard deepened into a true partnership. They traveled together, advised each other on professional challenges, and built a home that reflected both their tastes. Richard's love of historical architecture blending with Sarah's preference for clean, modern interiors. When Richard first invited her to attend a board meeting at Harrington Enterprises, it had been a casual suggestion. "You might find it interesting," he'd said over breakfast one morning. "We're discussing the Asian market expansion you've been researching for." Me. Sarah had expected to be a silent observer, perhaps taking a few notes for later discussion with Richard. Instead, he had introduced her to the board with unexpected formality. "Some of you know my wife, Sarah Mitchell. She's a partner at Ardent Capital and has extensive experience in international market analysis. I've asked her to join us today because her insights on the Asian expansion have been invaluable to my thinking." Throughout the meeting, Richard had deliberately drawn her into the conversation, asking pointed questions that highlighted her expertise. Some board members had been receptive, engaging with her observations thoughtfully. Others had been visibly uncomfortable with her presence, exchanging glances when she spoke. Victor, who held a board seat despite his limited involvement in day-to-day operations, had maintained a stony silence, his disapproval radiating across the conference table. Afterward, as they walked to the car together, Sarah had asked Richard about his strategy. "You knew that would ruffle feathers." Richard had smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes feathers need ruffling. The board has gotten too comfortable with groupthink. They needed to hear a different perspective." He'd taken her hand as they reached the parking garage. "Besides, I'm tired of pretending your financial acumen isn't one of our family's greatest assets." That meeting marked a turning point in Sarah's relationship with Harrington Enterprises. Though she never took a formal role in the company, her influence became more openly acknowledged. Richard began sharing more information with her, seeking her advice on major decisions, sometimes adjusting strategies based on her analysis. It was a partnership that benefited the company immensely. Harrington Enterprises grew steadily under their collaborative approach, expanding into new markets while maintaining the ethical standards Richard valued. Victor watched this evolution with thinly veiled contempt. At family gatherings, he would make pointed remarks about proper corporate governance and the dangers of pillow talk in business decisions. When other family members were present, he would reminisce about their father's traditional values and clear vision for the family's future. Comments clearly meant to position Richard's inclusive approach as a deviation from proper Harrington leadership. But as years passed and the company prospered, Victor's criticisms gained less traction. Board members who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's involvement came to value her insights. Longtime employees appreciated Richard's willingness to consider fresh perspectives. Even some extended family members began to acknowledge that Sarah's influence had strengthened rather than diminished the Harrington legacy. Sarah found an unexpected ally in Richard's Aunt Eleonora, the family matriarch who had once been a silent partner in the original Harrington business. During a Christmas gathering at Eleonora's estate, the older woman had taken Sarah aside, away from the family festivities. They underestimated me too, Eleanora had said, gesturing toward a faded photograph on her mantel, a black and white image of a much younger Eleanora standing beside Richard's grandfather at the opening of the first Harrington factory. Williams' brothers thought I was just decorative, a society wife with expensive tastes. They never knew I was the one who secured the financing that saved the company during the recession of '57. She had fixed Sarah with a penetrating gaze. My nephew doesn't make my brother's mistake. Richard sees your value, and that's precisely what terrifies Victor. That conversation had strengthened Sarah's resolve to continue navigating the complex dynamics of the Harrington family, with grace, but without apology for her influence. She would never be the passive corporate wife Victor thought more appropriate for his brother. She would never shrink her intelligence or hide her opinions to make others more comfortable. But she would also never use her position to diminish Richard or insert herself where her expertise wasn't relevant. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant adjustment and occasional compromise. There were missteps along the way, times when Sarah spoke too directly in meetings with traditional clients who weren't ready for her forthright style, or when Richard failed to recognize situations where his public deference to her judgment undermined his authority with certain board members. But they learned from these experiences, refining their partnership through honest communication and mutual respect. What neither of them had anticipated was how this carefully calibrated dynamic would be tested by Richard's illness, or how the foundation they had built together would ultimately determine the future of everything the Harrington name represented. The diagnosis came on an ordinary Tuesday. Richard had gone in for what should have been a routine physical, the kind of preventative health care he diligently scheduled every year despite his busy calendar. Sarah had been in a strategy meeting at the Women's Entrepreneurship Foundation she now chaired when her phone vibrated with his text. Doctor wants to discuss some test results. Nothing to worry about yet, but could you meet me at Memorial at 3? That "yet" had sent a cold tendril of fear through her chest, but Sarah maintained her composure through the remainder of the meeting, making thoughtful contributions to the discussion about microloan programs while her mind raced with possibilities. Only afterward, as she gathered her papers, did her assistant notice her hands trembling slightly. "Are you all right, Mrs. Harrington?" Jenny had asked. Sarah had straightened her spine, steadied her hands through sheer force of will. "I'm fine. I need to reschedule my afternoon appointments, though. Something's come up with Richard." The hospital corridor had seemed endless as Sarah walked toward the consultation room where Richard waited. Later, she would remember odd details about that walk: the squeak of her heels on the polished floor, the faint antiseptic smell, the cheerful floral paintings that seemed jarringly inappropriate for a place where lives were routinely shattered, with a few clinical words. Richard had risen when she entered, his face composed but pale. The oncologist, Dr. Patel, a woman with kind eyes and a direct manner, had waited until Sarah was seated beside Richard, their hands automatically finding each other before delivering the news that would reshape their world. "The mass in your left lung is malignant, Mr. Harrington. The PET scan shows concerning activity in nearby lymph nodes and possibly the liver as well. We need to do more tests, but based on what we're seeing, this appears to be stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer." Sarah had felt Richard's hand tighten around hers, had watched his face as he absorbed the information with the same thoughtful focus he brought to complex business problems. He'd asked precise, practical questions about treatment options, survival rates, next steps. Not once did his voice waver. Only later, in the privacy of their car in the hospital parking garage, did he allow himself a moment of raw vulnerability. "I'm not ready, Sarah," he'd said, his voice finally breaking. "We had plans. There was supposed to be more time." Sarah had reached across the console to cradle his face in her hands, forcing herself to be the strong one now. "Then we'll fight. For more time," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "Whatever it takes. We face this together, like everything else." That night, They had sat on their bedroom balcony until dawn, talking more openly than they ever had before, about regrets, fears, hopes, practical matters, spiritual questions. As the sky lightened from black to deep blue to the pink of early sunrise, they made promises to each other about how they would navigate this final journey together. "No secrets," Richard had said. "Complete honesty about how we're feeling, even when it's hard." "No wasting precious time on things that don't matter," Sarah had added. "Every day counts now. And no letting Victor hijack the company the moment." "I'm gone," Richard had said, his attempt at a smile not quite reaching his eyes. "He'll try, you know. He's probably already planning it." Sarah had squeezed his hand. "Let me worry about Victor. You focus on treatment." The months that followed established a new rhythm to their lives, one dictated by treatment schedules, medication side effects, good days and bad. Richard approached his cancer with the same disciplined determination he brought to business. Challenges. He researched extensively, consulted multiple specialists, followed treatment protocols meticulously. On days when he felt strong enough, he continued working remotely, refusing to surrender his identity to his illness. Sarah matched his resolve with her own brand of quiet strength. She became his advocate, his researcher, his buffer against well-meaning but exhausting visitors. She tracked his medications, monitored his nutrition, and maintained their household while continuing to chair her foundation and provide the behind-the-scenes guidance to Harrington Enterprises that had become essential to its operations. Victor's behavior during this period revealed much about his character. His initial response to Richard's diagnosis had seemed appropriate: concerned phone calls, offers of help, a large flower arrangement delivered to their home. But as weeks passed and it became clear that Richard intended to maintain his leadership role despite his illness, Victor's true priorities emerged. He began attending board meetings more regularly, positioning himself as the natural interim leader during what he referred to as "my brother's health challenge." He scheduled lunches with key board members and longtime clients, ostensibly to maintain relationships during this difficult time. He even hired a public relations consultant to help him craft his public image as the devoted brother stepping up during a family crisis. Richard observed these maneuvers with a mixture of resignation and dark amusement. "He's not even waiting for me to die," he remarked to Sarah one evening after hearing about Victor's lunch with their largest investor. "He's campaigning for my job while I'm sitting right here." "Let him campaign," Sarah had replied, adjusting Richard's pillows as he settled into bed. "It just shows everyone exactly who he is." But they both knew Victor's ambitions presented a genuine threat to everything they had built together. As Richard's health declined, Sarah began developing a strategic counterplan, not out of vindictiveness, but out of devotion to the values and vision she shared with her husband. It began with a series of private conversations with Richard's most trusted board members and advisors. Sarah didn't criticize Victor directly or make explicit claims about her own role in the company's future. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about succession planning, corporate governance, and maintaining the company's ethical commitments. "Richard is concerned about preserving the employee-first culture we've built," she said during coffee with Eleanor Hammond, the company's longest-serving board member. "He worries that in the wrong hands, short-term profit motives might erode the foundations of what makes Harrington special." Eleanor, who had initially been one of the board members most skeptical of Sarah's influence, now regarded her with newfound respect. "Richard's values are what distinguished him from his father," she observed. "William built a successful company, but Richard built a great one. That distinction matters." These conversations weren't just about securing allies. They were about ensuring that the people who would make decisions after Richard's death fully understood what was at stake. Sarah wasn't fighting for control out of ego or entitlement. She was fighting to protect a legacy of ethical business practices, employee welfare, and sustainable growth. Richard, meanwhile, was having his own difficult conversations with the company's legal team. "I need to be certain," he told Sarah after one particularly exhausting meeting, "that my wishes for the company can't be circumvented after I'm gone." Together, they crafted a succession plan that would preserve Richard's vision while acknowledging business realities. Sarah would receive controlling interest in Harrington Enterprises, with 2 longtime board members serving as co-trustees, to provide additional governance oversight. The arrangement would ensure continuity while protecting against any claims that Richard's decisions had been influenced by sentimentality rather than sound business judgment. As they finalized these plans, Richard and Sarah maintained their commitment to making the most of whatever time remained to them. On good days, when the treatments hadn't left him too depleted, they took drives to the coast, sat by the ocean watching waves roll in, reminisced about their 15 years together. "I have no regrets about us," Richard told her during one such outing, his voice weaker now but his eyes still bright with the intelligence and warmth that had first drawn her to him. "Meeting you was the best business decision I ever made." Sarah had laughed through her tears at his characteristic blend of romance and practicality. Always the CEO, even now. He had reached for her hand, his grip frailer than it once had been, but still warm and solid. "I mean it, Sarah. Everything good in my life these past 15 years, every moment of genuine happiness, every right decision, every bit of growth, has been because of what we built together." 3 weeks later, Richard slipped into a coma after a particularly aggressive round of treatment. Sarah maintained her vigil at his bedside, speaking to him softly, playing the classical music he loved, reading aloud from the books they had enjoyed together. The doctors were gentle but clear. His organs were failing. It was only a matter of time. Victor visited once during this period, standing awkwardly at the foot of Richard's hospital bed, his discomfort with illness and mortality painfully evident. "The board is concerned," he said to Sarah after a few minutes of stilted small talk. "There are decisions that need to be made, clients who need reassurance." Sarah had looked up from where she sat holding Richard's hand. "The board has been fully briefed on the succession plan," she replied quietly. "As for clients, they're being handled appropriately. Richard put contingencies in place months ago." Victor's expression had tightened. "You don't understand how these relationships work, Sarah. They're built on personal connections, trust that's developed over years. Our clients need to hear from family right now." The emphasis he placed on family hadn't been subtle. Sarah had simply returned her attention to Richard, effectively dismissing Victor without another word. He had left shortly afterward, his frustration evident in the sharp click of the door behind him. Richard died peacefully 3 days later, with Sarah whispering "I love you" against his hand as his breathing slowed, then stopped. In that moment of profound loss, she allowed herself to be simply a woman grieving her beloved husband, not a businesswoman with battles ahead, not the guardian of a corporate legacy, just Sarah, facing a world suddenly emptier without Richard's steady presence beside her. The funeral was a stately affair, befitting a man of Richard's standing in the business community. Hundreds attended: employees, clients, competitors, community leaders. Sarah greeted them all with dignified composure, accepting condolences with quiet grace while maintaining the emotional boundaries necessary for her to get through the day. Victor delivered a eulogy that painted a very specific portrait of his brother, emphasizing his place in the Harrington family tradition, his continuation of their father's business philosophy, his role as the latest in a line of patriarchs, extending back 3 generations. It was, Sarah noted, a eulogy that conveniently erased much of what had made Richard unique: his progressive leadership style, his ethical innovations, his willingness to evolve beyond the rigid hierarchies of his father's era. When Sarah spoke after him, she didn't directly contradict Victor's characterization. Instead, she shared small, specific memories that revealed the man behind the business leader. Richard's habit of leaving encouraging notes for junior employees he thought showed promise, His insistence on learning the names of the custodial staff who cleaned the offices after hours, his annual tradition of personally serving food at the company's holiday party rather than making a grand entrance as CEO. Richard believed that true leadership wasn't about position or authority, she said, her voice steady despite her grief. It was about service, integrity, and vision. He measured success not by quarterly profits, but by the lives improved through our work together. Employees who could afford to send their children to college, communities strengthened by our ethical business practices, a corporate culture where everyone's contribution was valued. She had looked directly at Victor then, meeting his gaze with quiet intensity. That is the legacy I promise to protect. That is the standard by which all future leadership of Harrington Enterprises will be measured. The reading of the will, a week later, formalized what Victor had likely suspected but hoped to prevent. Richard had left controlling interest in Harrington Enterprises to Sarah, with specific directives about maintaining the company's ethical commitments and employee-centered policies. The co-trustee arrangement with 2 senior board members provided additional governance oversight while ensuring Sarah's perspective would remain central to decision-making. Victor's response had been predictably volatile. "This is absurd," he had sputtered in the attorney's office, face flushing with anger. "She knows nothing about running a company of this size. This will destroy everything our family built." Sarah had remained seated, hands folded in her lap as Victor continued his tirade. The family attorney, Mr. Goldman, who had worked with the Harringtons for over 30 years, finally intervened. "Mr. Harrington, your brother was of sound mind when these documents were prepared and executed," he said firmly. "His wishes are clear and legally binding. If you wish to challenge the will, that is your right, but I would advise against it. The documentation of your brother's intentions is extensive and would withstand scrutiny." In the weeks following that confrontation, Victor had launched what amounted to a multi-front campaign to undermine Sarah's position. He called emergency board meetings to question her qualifications. He spoke to business reporters about his concerns for the company's future. He even reached out to Richard's first wife, Clarissa, to explore possible legal challenges to the will based on outdated prenuptial agreements. Throughout this onslaught, Sarah maintained her composure, attending every board meeting thoroughly prepared, addressing concerns directly, and demonstrating a depth of knowledge about Harrington Enterprises that surprised even longtime executives. She didn't engage in public battles with Victor or respond to his thinly veiled criticisms in the business press. Instead, she focused on stabilizing the company during the leadership transition, meeting personally with key clients to reassure them about continuity, and implementing the strategic initiatives she and Richard had developed together during his illness. This measured approach gradually shifted perceptions within the company and the broader business community. Board members who had initially harbored reservations about Sarah's leadership began to appreciate her steady hand and strategic clarity. Employees who had worried about dramatic changes under new leadership found their concerns addressed through transparent communication and consistent policy decisions. Even some business reporters who had initially amplified Victor's concerns began to note the company's stable performance and smooth transition under Sarah's guidance. But Sarah knew that Victor would not be dissuaded by these initial successes. His sense of entitlement to the Harrington legacy ran too deep, his resentment of her influence too ingrained. If she wanted to truly secure her position and protect Richard's vision for the company, she would need to do more than simply defend against Victor's attacks. She would need to demonstrate decisively that underestimating her had been Victor's most fundamental mistake. The opportunity to do so emerged from an unexpected quarter. During a routine review of Harrington Enterprises' investment portfolio, something Sarah had insisted on conducting personally rather than delegating to the financial team, she noticed a pattern of transactions involving Vertex Holdings, the private equity firm that owned a controlling interest in Victor's company, Innovatech Solutions. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't the transactions themselves, which appeared entirely legitimate, but rather the timing. Vertex had acquired their stake in Innovatech shortly after Richard had declined to increase Harrington Enterprises' investment in Victor's struggling company 3 years earlier. At the time, Victor had presented the Vertex partnership as a fortuitous connection made through industry contacts, a strategic alliance that would provide both capital and expertise. Sarah remembered Richard's skepticism about the arrangement. Vertex doesn't typically invest in mid-stage tech companies, he had observed. They prefer mature businesses with stable cash flow. Victor's company doesn't fit their usual profile. Now, looking at the transaction history with fresh eyes, Sarah began to see connections she and Richard had missed. Vertex Holdings was owned primarily by the Lowell family, with whom Sarah had developed a relationship through her nonprofit work. Marion Lowell, the family matriarch, served on the same foundation board as Sarah, though they had never discussed business matters. In that context, on impulse, Sarah called Marion and invited her to lunch, a social courtesy that would not raise eyebrows given their shared philanthropic interests. Over salads at a quiet restaurant, their conversation meandered through foundation business before Sarah carefully steered it toward family matters. "How is your son managing the transition at Vertex?" she asked casually. Richard always spoke highly of James's business acumen. Marion had smiled warmly. "James is doing well, though he's finding the shift from operations to pure investment strategy challenging. He was quite proud of the Innovatech acquisition, said it diversified their portfolio nicely in the tech sector." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Victor must have made a compelling case. Innovatech was still finding its footing. When Vertex came in, Marion's expression turned slightly puzzled. "Actually, I believe it was Richard who first brought the opportunity to James's attention. At least, that's my understanding. Something about wanting outside perspective on his brother's company without family dynamics complicating things." This casual revelation sent Sarah's mind racing. Richard had never mentioned facilitating the connection between Vertex and Innovatech. In fact, he had expressed surprise when Victor announced the investment, which meant either Marion was mistaken or Victor had deliberately misrepresented the situation, perhaps to both sides. Further investigation over the following weeks confirmed Sarah's suspicions. Victor had leveraged his position as Richard's brother to approach Vertex, implying that Harrington Enterprises was considering a major investment in Innovatech, but wanted a co-investor to share the risk. He had then used Vertex's interest to pressure Richard into maintaining Harrington's existing investment level, creating the impression that major outside investors saw value in his company. It was a classic Victor manipulation, not strictly fraudulent, but ethically questionable and built on misrepresentations. More importantly to Sarah, it revealed a vulnerability. Victor had been so focused on positioning himself as Richard's rightful successor that he had neglected to secure his own corporate position. Innovatech remained dependent on Vertex's continued support, and Vertex had made their investment based, partly on assumed connections to Harrington Enterprises. As Sarah pieced together this complex web of relationships and dependencies, a plan began to take shape. Not just a defensive strategy to protect her position at Harrington, but a bold move that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic between her and Victor. Marion Lowell had mentioned during their lunch that Vertex was considering restructuring some of its holdings. James is interested in focusing more on their core industries: manufacturing, real estate, consumer goods. Some of their technology investments haven't performed as expected. This casual comment, combined with Sarah's financial analysis of Vertex's portfolio, suggested an opportunity. Through Meridian Partners, the private investment vehicle she had established years earlier, Sarah began quietly exploring the possibility of acquiring Vertex's stake in Victor's company. The idea wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about securing leverage that would force Victor to recognize her as a legitimate business leader, not just Richard's widow. It was about protecting both companies from his impulsive leadership. And perhaps most importantly, It was about honoring a promise she had made to Richard in his final weeks. "I won't let him undo everything we built." The acquisition of Vertex Holdings' stake in Innovatech required precision, discretion, and perfect timing. Sarah approached it not as an emotional response to Victor's antagonism, but as the strategic business move it needed to be. She began with thorough research, compiling a detailed analysis of Innovatech's market position, intellectual property assets, and growth potential, the kind of comprehensive evaluation she would have conducted for any significant investment. What she discovered confirmed her initial instincts. Despite Victor's erratic leadership, the company's core technology, an innovative approach to supply chain automation using predictive analytics, had genuine value. The engineering team, led by a brilliant but underappreciated CTO named Diane, Chen, had developed solutions that outperformed competitors in several key metrics. The problem wasn't the product, it was the executive strategy. "They're bleeding talent," Sarah murmured to herself one evening, reviewing employee departure data she'd obtained through industry contacts. 4 senior engineers in the last 6 months alone. Exit interviews painted a consistent picture. A toxic culture where credit was hoarded at the top, technical expertise was dismissed in favor of marketing flash, and Victor's volatile management style created an environment of fear rather than innovation. It was precisely the opposite of the employee-centered approach Richard had championed at Harrington Enterprises. Armed with this analysis, Sarah arranged a private meeting with James Lowell, Marion's son and the current CEO of Vertex Holdings. She chose neutral territory, a private dining room at the university club where neither of them was likely to encounter business associates. "I appreciate you making time for this, James," Sarah said after they had exchanged pleasantries. "I know we're both juggling complex responsibilities these days." James nodded, his expression guarded but curious. "My mother speaks very highly of your work with the foundation. She was quite insistent that I should hear you out." Sarah smiled, mentally thanking Marion for her subtle advocacy. "I'll be direct then. I understand Vertex is considering restructuring its technology holdings to focus more on your core industries." James's eyebrows rose slightly. "We're evaluating several options," he acknowledged cautiously. "But we haven't made any public announcements about specific divestments." "Of course," Sarah replied smoothly. "I'm not here fishing for insider information. I have a specific proposition regarding Innovatech Solutions." She slid a slim folder across the table. "Meridian Partners would like to acquire Vertex's controlling interest." James opened the folder, scanning the offer document with practiced efficiency. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed his posture straighten with interest as he noted the proposed purchase price, a 15% premium over Vertex's initial investment, despite Innovatech's uneven performance. "This is unexpectedly generous," he said finally, looking up to meet her gaze, "particularly given the company's recent struggles." Sarah nodded. "The current management has made some questionable decisions," she acknowledged, "but the underlying technology is sound, and the engineering team is exceptional. With proper leadership and strategic direction, I believe Innovatech could realize its potential." James studied her for a moment. "May I ask why Meridian Partners is interested? This isn't your typical investment profile." It was a fair question, one Sarah had anticipated. "I see synergies with other holdings that aren't immediately obvious from the outside," she said carefully. "Additionally, I believe in supporting innovative solutions that have practical applications for manufacturing efficiency. It aligns with my late husband's vision for American manufacturing competitiveness." The mention of Richard wasn't calculated manipulation. It was simply truth. This acquisition would indeed honor his belief in ethical business leadership and technological innovation. The fact that it would also neutralize Victor's most potent weapon against her was a secondary benefit, necessary but not sufficient justification for such a significant investment. James closed the folder thoughtfully. Victor Harrington is challenging to work with, he said, choosing his words with diplomatic care. Our board has had concerns about his management approach for some time, but he's been resistant to guidance. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. I'm familiar with Victor's independent thinking. A flash of understanding crossed James's face as he connected the dots. This is about more than just the technology, isn't it? Business is always about more than just the products, Sarah replied evenly. It's about relationships, vision, and values. Richard understood that. Victor never has. After a moment, James nodded. I'll need to present this to our board, of course. But speaking personally, I find the offer compelling. Vertex has been looking for an exit strategy from Innovatech for several months. Victor has been difficult about our suggestions for operational improvements. I can imagine, Sarah said dryly. By the time dessert arrived, they had outlined a framework for the acquisition, including a timeline that would allow Vertex to make a graceful exit while positioning Meridian Partners as a white knight rather than a hostile takeover. James seemed relieved to have found a solution that would please his board while avoiding a potentially messy public conflict with Victor. As they shook hands at the conclusion of their meeting, James held Sarah's gaze with newfound respect. Richard always said you were the strategist in the family, he remarked. I see he wasn't exaggerating. Richard was generous in his assessments, Sarah replied modestly. James shook his head slightly. No, I don't think he was. Not about this. The weeks that followed required all of Sarah's multitasking abilities. While continuing to lead Harrington Enterprises through its post-Richard transition, she simultaneously orchestrated the Innovatech acquisition through Meridian Partners, keeping the two processes carefully separated to avoid any potential conflicts of interest. She assembled a small team of trusted advisors, her longtime attorney from before her marriage, a former colleague from Ardent Capital, and a retired technology executive who had mentored her through a women's leadership program to help manage the complex transaction. Throughout this period, Victor continued his campaign to undermine her position at Harrington Enterprises, seemingly oblivious to the counter-moves taking place just beyond his field of vision. His latest tactic involved cultivating relationships with two newer board members, suggesting to them that Sarah's leadership was merely a temporary accommodation to Richard's sentimentality rather than a sustainable business arrangement. The Harrington name means something in this industry, he told them during a private dinner Sarah learned about through her network. Our clients expect certain traditions to be maintained. Sarah is intelligent, of course, but she doesn't understand the weight of legacy. What Victor failed to recognize was how thoroughly Sarah had integrated herself into the company's operations during Richard's illness. While he had been positioning himself publicly as the heir apparent, she had been quietly building relationships with key personnel, mastering operational details, and demonstrating her value to people whose opinions actually mattered to the business. The division head for international operations, Michael Chen, had worked closely with Sarah on expanding their Asian market presence, a strategy she had initially proposed based on her analysis at Ardent Capital years earlier. When Victor approached, him suggesting that changes might be coming in leadership, Michael had politely but firmly expressed his confidence in the current direction. Mrs. Harrington has demonstrated exceptional understanding of our international challenges, he reported. Back to Sarah afterward. Mr. Victor seemed surprised by my assessment. Similar scenarios played out across the organization as Victor discovered that his assumptions about Sarah's isolation within the company were fundamentally flawed. The CFO valued her financial acumen. The head of product development appreciated her thoughtful questions about innovation pipelines. Even the HR director, initially skeptical about an outsider leading the family business, had been won over by Sarah's genuine commitment to maintaining the employee-centered culture Richard had established. These realizations should have caused Victor to reassess his approach. Instead, they only intensified his determination to wrest control of what he still considered his birthright. His attacks became more desperate, less strategic, calling for unnecessary financial audits, questioning routine business decisions in board meetings, even suggesting to longtime clients that they might want to diversify their vendor relationships during this uncertain transition period. When the final paperwork for the Vertex acquisition was ready, Sarah scheduled the confrontation with Victor that had been inevitable since Richard's death. She chose the setting deliberately, the dining room of what Victor still thought of as Richard's house, though it now belonged solely to Sarah. The familiar environment would give him a false sense of security, while the domestic setting would minimize the possibility of a public scene if his reaction turned volatile. Victor arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that subtly signaled his conception of himself as the rightful business leader of the family. Sarah greeted him with professional courtesy, offering coffee and leading him to the dining room where she had arranged the setting with careful attention to psychological detail, seating herself at the head of the table where Richard would have sat, positioning Victor to her right rather than across from her, subtly reinforcing the new power dynamic before their conversation even began. "I appreciate you making time for this, Victor," she began, her tone pleasant but businesslike. "I think it's important that we discuss the future of both our companies directly, without intermediaries." Victor's expression registered momentary confusion at her reference to both our companies, but he quickly recovered, settling into the condescending smile she had endured for 15 years. "I'm glad you're finally being realistic, Sarah. This transition has been unnecessarily complicated. If you had accepted my guidance from the beginning, we could have arranged a much smoother handover." Sarah didn't correct his misinterpretation. Instead, she sipped her water calmly. "You've been very clear about your opinion of my leadership capabilities," she acknowledged, "and about what you consider my rightful place in the Harrington business. Hierarchy." Victor nodded, clearly pleased that she seemed to be conceding his point. "It's not personal," he said, his tone falsely generous. "You're simply not equipped to lead a company of this complexity. The board understands this, our clients understand this, and deep down, I think you understand it too." "What's interesting," Sarah replied, setting down her glass with deliberate precision, "is how completely you've misunderstood the actual dynamics at play. The board has full confidence in my leadership, something you'd know if you bothered to speak with them individually, rather than assuming their support. Our clients have seen no disruption in service or quality, and the company's performance metrics have remained strong despite the significant challenge of losing its founder." Victor's smile tightened. "Quarterly results can be manipulated, as you well know. The real test will come with long-term strategic decisions, the kind that require deep industry knowledge and connections. Like the strategic decision to partner with Vertex Holdings for Innovatech's funding," Sarah asked mildly. The subtle shift in topic caught Victor off guard. "That was a successful partnership that brought significant capital and expertise to my company," he said cautiously. "A partnership you misrepresented to both sides," Sarah corrected him. "You implied to Richard that Vertex had approached you independently, while suggesting to Vertex that Harrington Enterprises was considering a major investment alongside them. Creative negotiating, certainly, but not exactly the transparent business practices our father-in-law valued." Victor's expression darkened. "You're overstepping, Sarah. My company's financing arrangements are none of your concern." "That's where you're wrong," Sarah replied, reaching for the folder beside her place. Setting. As of yesterday at 3 p.m., Meridian Partners completed the acquisition of Vertex Holdings' controlling interest in Innovatech Solutions. So your company's financing arrangements are, in fact, very much my concern. She slid the folder across the table, watching as Victor's expression transformed from dismissive irritation to shocked disbelief as he scanned the acquisition documents. The color drained from his face, then returned in a flush of anger. You can't," he sputtered, looking up with undisguised fury. "This is some kind of manipulation, some legal trick." It's a straightforward business transaction, Sarah corrected him calmly. Vertex wanted to divest their technology holdings to focus on core industries. Meridian Partners saw value in Innovatech's underlying technology and engineering team. The board approved the acquisition unanimously. Victor pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. I'll fight this. The board can't approve a change in controlling interest without the CEO's involvement. Actually, they can, Sarah replied. If you had reviewed your financing agreements more carefully, you'd have noticed that the terms gave Vertex exceptional authority in the event of leadership concerns. Your repeated rejection of their operational improvement suggestions triggered those provisions. The legal details are on page 4 if you're interested. As the full implications of his situation dawned on him, Victor's expression shifted from anger to something approaching panic. For the first time, he was seeing Sarah, really seeing her, not as his brother's decorative wife, but as a formidable strategic opponent who had outmaneuvered him completely. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. Sarah folded, her hands on the table, meeting his gaze directly. "I want what Richard wanted, for both companies to thrive ethically and sustainably. You have technical expertise that's valuable, Victor. You could continue to play an important role at Innovatech, but not as CEO, and certainly not with your current approach to leadership." Victor's laugh was bitter. "So I'm supposed to work for my sister-in-law now, take orders from Richards. Widow? You're supposed to contribute your talents in a way that serves the company's mission rather than just your ego," Sarah corrected him. "The choice of whether to do so is entirely yours. The companies will move forward either way." In that moment, the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 15 years inverted completely. Victor, who had dismissed, undermined, and belittled Sarah at every opportunity, now found himself dependent on her decisions for his professional future. Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced poise. "Take some time to think about it. My assistant will contact yours tomorrow to schedule a formal meeting at Harrington Enterprises to discuss your options." She gathered her folder and moved toward the door, pausing briefly. "For what it's worth, Victor, Richard always believed you had potential. He just thought you needed better guidance." With that, she walked out, leaving Victor alone in the dining room that now symbolized everything he had lost through his own arrogance and misjudgment. As she stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The confrontation she had been preparing for since Richard's diagnosis was finally behind her. Now, the real work could begin. In the weeks that followed, Sarah focused on integrating Innovatech's valuable innovations with Harrington Enterprises' manufacturing expertise, while maintaining appropriate corporate separation to avoid conflicts of interest. She promoted Diane Chen, the brilliant but undervalued CTO, to lead Innovatech as interim CEO, giving her the authority and recognition Victor had consistently denied her. "I don't understand," Diane had said when Sarah offered her the position. "Why me? There are more experienced executives you could bring in from outside." "Because you understand both the technology and the people who create it," Sarah had replied simply, "and because loyalty deserves to be rewarded." Under Diane's leadership, with Sarah's strategic guidance, Innovatech began to flourish. So, toxic culture Victor had created gradually transformed as engineers who had been considering departure decided to stay, encouraged by the new direction. Projects that had stalled under Victor's micromanagement gained momentum. Client relationships strengthened as delivery timelines were finally met consistently. Victor, after several days of silence, had chosen a path few would have predicted. Rather than fighting Sarah's authority or storming off to start a new venture, he accepted a position as Chief Strategy Officer at Innovatech, a role that utilized his market knowledge and big-picture thinking while insulating the organization from his management weaknesses. "Why did you offer me anything at all?" he asked Sarah during their first formal meeting after the acquisition. "You could have pushed me out completely." Sarah had considered her answer carefully. because Richard was right about you having potential. Your problem was never intelligence or vision, it was how you treated people. If you can learn to value others' contributions instead of just your own, you have a great deal to offer. Victor had nodded slowly, a new humility evident in his demeanor. Richard said something similar once. I didn't listen then. Maybe now you will, Sarah had replied, not unkindly. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Victor still had moments of arrogance, still occasionally tried to circumvent the new leadership structure. But with clear boundaries and consistent consequences, he gradually began to adapt to his new reality, and even, on rare occasions, to acknowledge the benefits of the more collaborative approach Sarah and Diane had implemented. 6 months after the acquisition, Sarah stood at the podium during Harrington Enterprises' annual shareholders meeting, presenting results that exceeded expectations despite the significant leadership transition. The company had not only maintained its market position, but had expanded into new sectors, leveraging the synergies between traditional manufacturing and Innovatech's advanced supply chain technologies. Our founder believed that business success and ethical leadership were not competing priorities but complementary strengths, Sarah told the assembled shareholders, her voice steady and confident. The results we're sharing today validate that vision. By prioritizing innovation, employee development, and sustainable practices, we've delivered exceptional financial returns while strengthening our position for long-term growth. As applause filled the auditorium, Sarah glanced toward the front row where Victor sat among other executives. Their eyes met briefly, and he offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Not warm, perhaps, but respectful in a way that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Later that evening, after the formal proceedings had concluded, Sarah returned to the home she had shared with Richard. Though his absence still created an ache that never fully subsided, the house no longer felt haunted by loss the way it had in those first raw months after his death. Now it contained memories that sustained rather than wounded, evidence of a life well lived, and a partnership that had transformed them both. In Richard's study, where she now conducted much of her work, Sarah opened the small mahogany box that held her most treasured mementos. Among them was the silver watch her father had given her at her college graduation, still keeping perfect time after all these years. She slipped it onto her wrist, running her fingers over the inscription on the back. Time is the most valuable thing you can spend. How true that had proven to be. The time she had spent building her career at Ardent Capital, the years of partnership with Richard, even the difficult months of his illness, all had contributed to making her the leader she had become. Not just Richard's widow, not just a placeholder in a family business, but a formidable force in her own right, someone who had earned her position through intelligence, perseverance, and unwavering commitment to her values. Sarah closed the box gently and moved to the window, looking out at the garden Richard had loved tending on weekend mornings. She had maintained it in his absence, learning about the plants that had been his passion, finding unexpected peace in the rhythmic tasks of weeding and pruning. Like the companies now under her guidance, the garden required both vision and patience, the ability to see potential where others might miss it, and the wisdom to nurture growth rather than forcing it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, potential acquisition in Europe, negotiations with the labor union at their largest manufacturing facility, ongoing technological integration between Harrington's traditional operations and Innovatech's innovations. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had protected what mattered. She had proven her worth beyond any doubt. And perhaps most importantly, she had created a path forward that honored Richard's legacy while establishing her own. Not bad, she thought with a small smile, for someone Victor had dismissed as just a trophy wife who got lucky with the timing. As darkness settled over the garden, Sarah turned away from the window and back toward her desk, where tomorrow's briefing materials awaited her attention. The journey hadn't ended with her victory over Victor. In many ways, it had only just begun. But she faced the future now not as someone fighting for legitimacy, but as a leader confidently charting her own course. The inheritance Victor had claimed she didn't deserve had never been about money or corporate titles. It had been about vision, values, and the courage to stand firm when others underestimated you. Those were gifts Richard had recognized in her from their first meeting, qualities he had encouraged but never created. They had been hers all along, waiting for the moment when circumstances would call them forth. That moment had come, and Sarah Mitchell Harrington had risen to meet it, not as anyone's widow, but as herself, capable, determined, and finally seen for exactly who she was. 3 years after the acquisition that transformed both Harrington Enterprises and Innovatech Solutions, Sarah stood at the window of her corner office, watching the late afternoon sunlight glint off the harbor below. The skyline had changed since she'd first arrived in this city as a young financial analyst. New towers rising alongside historic buildings, much like the way she had built something new while honoring the foundations Richard had established. A knock at the door interrupted. Her reflection. "The board members are all here," her executive assistant Mia announced. "They're gathered in the main conference room." Sarah nodded, smoothing her blazer, a deep teal that brought out the green in her eyes. "Thank you. I'll be right there." Today marked a significant milestone, the official announcement of a succession plan she had been carefully developing for the past 18 months. Not her departure. At 58, Sarah had no intention of retiring, but rather a restructuring that would secure the company's future beyond any single leader. It was the culmination of a vision that had started with protecting Richard's legacy but had evolved into something uniquely her own. As she gathered her presentation materials, Sarah caught her reflection in the glass awards cabinet. The Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year trophy, the Forbes Most Innovative Companies plaque, the Women in Business Leadership Award she'd received last fall. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the uncertain widow who had faced down Victor in her dining room 3 years ago. This Sarah stood taller, her gaze steadier, her presence more commanding. Experience had chiseled away, hesitation, leaving clarity and purpose in its place. The boardroom fell silent as Sarah entered. 12 faces turned toward her, the expanded board that now included 3 women and 2 people of color, a diversity initiative she had championed against significant resistance from old guard members. Even Victor was present, occupying the seat reserved for Innovatech's representative, his expression guarded, but no longer openly hostile. "Thank you all for making time for this special session," Sarah began, taking her place at the head of the table. "As you know from our agenda, today we're discussing the Horizon Initiative, our comprehensive plan for leadership development and organizational structure for the next decade." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah outlined her vision with the precision and strategic clarity that had become her hallmark. The plan was bold, yet practical. A new corporate structure that would transform both Harrington Enterprises and Innovatech into a unified entity called Harrington Innovation Group, with specialized divisions maintaining their operational independence while benefiting from shared resources and coordinated strategy. "The days of siloed operations and personality-driven leadership are behind us," Sarah explained, advancing to a slide showing the proposed executive structure. "Our competitive advantage in today's market comes from collaborative innovation and institutional knowledge that transcends any individual." She could see the mix of reactions around the table: excitement from newer board members, cautious consideration from longtime Harrington loyalists, and barely concealed surprise from Victor, who clearly hadn't expected such a comprehensive reimagining of the corporate structure. "This doesn't just change how we operate," Sarah continued. "It fundamentally shifts how we develop and recognize leadership talent throughout the organization." The Management Acceleration Program we launched last year has already identified 30 high-potential employees across all divisions. Under this new structure, they'll rotate through key operational areas, gaining broad perspective while receiving mentorship from senior leaders. Gerald Foster, one of the older board members who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's leadership, leaned forward. "This is ambitious, Sarah. Implementing a change of this magnitude could create significant disruption." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the concern. "You're right, Gerald. That's why we've designed a 3-year implementation timeline with clear milestones and contingency plans." She advanced to the next slide, displaying a detailed transition schedule. "We'll begin with integrating the research and development teams across divisions, then move to operations and finally marketing and sales. Each phase includes comprehensive training and communication strategies to ensure smooth transitions." The questions continued for nearly an hour, detailed inquiries about financial implications, leadership assignments, potential market reactions. Sarah addressed each with the same thoughtful precision, demonstrating both the depth of her preparation and her intimate understanding of every aspect of the business. This wasn't a presentation developed by consultants or delegated to a strategy team. This was Sarah's vision, crafted through countless hours of analysis, reflection, and consultation with key stakeholders throughout the organization. When Victor finally spoke, his question carried none of the dismissive tone that had once characterized his interactions with Sarah. "The transition timeline is ambitious," he observed, studying the projected financials. "What contingencies have you built in for the inevitable resistance from middle management, particularly in the traditional manufacturing divisions?" It was a legitimate question, exactly the kind of practical concern that revealed Victor's value when he focused on business issues rather than personal agendas. Sarah acknowledged him with a respectful nod. "We've identified potential resistance points through confidential surveys and focus groups," she replied. "The implementation team includes respected leaders from every division, specifically chosen for their ability to influence their peers. Additionally, we've developed a comprehensive incentive structure that rewards collaborative behavior and measurable progress toward integration milestones." Victor considered this, then nodded slowly. "Thoughtful approach. I'd suggest adding specialized training for team leaders specifically addressing how to manage ambiguity during transition periods. We found that effective during Innovatech's reorganization last year." "Excellent suggestion," Sarah agreed. "I'll have HR incorporate that into the implementation plan." This brief exchange symbolized how far they had come, from bitter antagonists to professional colleagues capable of building on each other's ideas. It hadn't been a straight path to this new dynamic. The first year after the acquisition had been particularly challenging, with Victor alternating between grudging cooperation and passive resistance. But a turning point had come during the global supply chain crisis 18 months ago, when Victor's market insights and Sarah's operational leadership had combined to navigate challenges that had crippled their competitors. "We should have the final vote at next month's regular session," Sarah concluded, closing her presentation. "That gives everyone time to review the complete proposal and submit any additional questions. My team and I are available for individual discussions if anyone wants to dive deeper into specific aspects before the vote." As the board members gathered their materials and filed out, several stopped to compliment Sarah on the thoroughness of the plan. Even the most traditional members seemed energized by the vision she had presented, a future that honored the company's heritage while embracing the innovation necessary for continued growth. Victor lingered after the others had departed, approaching Sarah as she collected her notes. "Impressive work," he said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. Richard would have appreciated the balance between respecting tradition and pushing boundaries. Sarah looked up, momentarily surprised by this unsolicited acknowledgement. "Thank you, Victor. That means a lot coming from you." He shrugged slightly, a gesture that might have seemed dismissive years ago but now read as genuine modesty. "I know what it's like to build something from a vision others can't see yet. The difference is, you've learned how to bring people along with you. That's a skill I'm still working on." The admission of a personal growth area, however small, represented a profound shift from the Victor who had once declared her unworthy of any role in his family business. Sarah offered a small smile of recognition. The leadership development program has space for experienced executives too, you know. It's not just for rising stars. Victor actually chuckled, a sound Sarah had rarely heard from him. Maybe I'll sit in on a few sessions. Discreetly, of course. Can't have the young talent thinking the old guard needs remedial training. We call it continuous improvement these days, Sarah replied with a wry smile. Much better for the ego. As Victor nodded goodbye and turned to leave, Sarah felt a curious sense of completion. Not an ending, but the closing of a difficult chapter and the opening of a more productive one. The man who had once been her most determined adversary would never become a close ally, but they had found a way to work together that benefited them both and, more importantly, strengthened the companies they led. Back in her office, Sarah found a message waiting from Diane Chen, now the fully established CEO of Innovatech and one of Sarah's most valued colleagues. Heard your presentation knocked it out of the park. No surprise there. Let's celebrate. Over dinner tonight? 7 at Luciana's? Sarah smiled as she texted back her acceptance. Her relationship with Diane had evolved from mentor-protege to a genuine friendship between equals, one of many unexpected gifts that had emerged from the challenges of the past few years. Diane's technical brilliance complemented Sarah's strategic vision, creating a partnership that had accelerated innovation across both companies. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and decisions, reviewing marketing materials for a new product launch, approving final budgets for the upcoming quarter, interviewing a promising candidate for the sustainability director position. Sarah moved through each task with focused attention, fully present in a way that had become her hallmark as a leader. At 6:30, she closed her laptop and prepared to meet Diane for their celebration dinner. As she gathered her things, her gaze fell on the small silver-framed photograph she kept on her desk. Richard and Sarah on their 10th anniversary, laughing together on the deck of a sailboat, the wind tousling their hair, happiness radiating from both their faces. "We did it, Richard," she murmured, touching the frame gently. "Not exactly how we planned, but we got there." The pain of his absence had softened over time, transforming from the sharp grief of early widowhood to a gentle melancholy that coexisted peacefully with her ongoing life. Sarah had never expected to navigate this chapter alone, but she had. Discovered reserves of strength and purpose that might have remained dormant in a different life path. Luciana's was bustling when Sarah arrived, the upscale Italian restaurant a favorite among the city's business elite. Diane had already secured their usual corner table, a bottle of champagne chilling beside it. "There she is, the architect of the future Harrington Innovation Group," Diane greeted her, rising to offer a warm hug. At 42, Diane had blossomed. From the quietly brilliant engineer Victor had overlooked into a confident executive whose technical expertise was now matched by impressive leadership skills. "The board hasn't officially approved it yet," Sarah reminded her as they settled into their seats. Diane waved this off with a smile. "A formality. Even the old guard is on board. Gerald Foster cornered me after the meeting to tell me how impressed he was with the transition strategy. If you've won over Gerald, the rest is just paperwork." The waiter appeared to pour their champagne, and Diane raised her glass in a toast. To vision becoming reality, and to the woman who made it happen. Sarah clinked her glass against Diane's, but added a gentle correction. To all of us who made it happen. This was never a solo effort. As they enjoyed their meal, the conversation flowed from business to personal matters. Diane shared updates about her daughter's college applications and her husband's new research grant. Sarah talked about the photography class she had recently joined, a hobby she had taken up 2 years ago as a way to explore creativity outside the corporate environment. "I've been thinking about that mentorship program you're so passionate about," Diane said as they lingered over espresso. "The one for women returning to the workforce after career breaks. Sarah nodded. The Women's Reentry Initiative was a nonprofit project she had founded shortly after taking control of Harrington Enterprises, using part of her inheritance to create opportunities for women whose careers had been interrupted by caregiving responsibilities or other life circumstances. "We're expanding again," she confirmed, "opening a third training center next month. The demand has been overwhelming." "I'd like to get more involved," Diane said. "Maybe teach some technical workshops or mentor a few participants directly. Seeing what you've built with the program, it's inspired me to think about my own legacy beyond just corporate success." Sarah smiled, genuine pleasure warming her expression. "I'd love that. The women in our program would benefit enormously from your experience." "You've changed so many lives with that initiative," Diane observed. "Not just the participants, but their families too. All while transforming two major companies. Where do you find the energy?" Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "I think it comes from finally being fully aligned with my purpose," she said after a moment. "For years, I was navigating between other people's expectations and my own instincts. Even with Richard, who was incredibly supportive, I was always conscious of being Richard Harrington's wife in certain contexts. Now, there's no division between who I am and what I do. That creates its own energy." Diane nodded slowly. "I understand that. Before you promoted me, I was constantly shifting between what Victor wanted to hear and what I knew was actually happening with our technology. The mental gymnastics were exhausting." "Authenticity is efficient," Sarah said with a smile. "Among other benefits." Later that evening, as her driver navigated the quiet streets toward home, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened but determined widow who had faced Victor across her dining room 3 years ago could never have imagined the scope of what she would build from that confrontation. Not just a secure position for herself, but a transformed corporate culture, expanded opportunities for overlooked talent, and a vision for the future that extended far beyond her own leadership. The house was quiet when she arrived, but not lonely. Sarah had made peace with solitude, finding in it not isolation, but space for reflection and rejuvenation. She kicked off her heels and padded to the kitchen in stocking feet, pouring a small glass of wine before making her way to the back patio where she often ended her evenings. The garden Richard had loved was now truly hers as well, transformed by her own vision while still honoring his initial design. She had added a meditation area with a small fountain, expanded the herb garden he had started, and installed subtle lighting that extended her enjoyment of the space into the evening hours. Like the companies she now led, the garden represented both continuity and evolution, a living testament to growth that builds upon rather than erases what came before. Sarah settled into her favorite chair, sipping her wine as she contemplated the stars visible through the breaks in the trees above. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the detailed work of implementing the vision she had presented today, the ongoing responsibility of leading two interconnected organizations through continuous change, the personal commitment to maintaining balance in her life despite the demands of her position. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply be present in her accomplishment. She had not only survived Victor's attempts to push her aside, she had transformed both their companies and, in the process, herself. The woman who had once been dismissed as just a trophy wife who got lucky with the timing was now recognized as one of the most innovative business leaders in the industry, respected by colleagues, featured in business publications, invited to speak at prestigious conferences about corporate transformation and inclusive leadership. More meaningful than these external validations, however, was the internal certainty Sarah now carried with her daily. She no longer questioned her right to lead or her capacity to handle challenges. She had proven herself not just to Victor and the board and the business community, but most importantly, to herself. As she finished her wine and prepared to head, inside, Sarah's phone chimed with a message notification. It was from James Lowell at Vertex Holdings. board unanimously approved the joint venture proposal. Contracts ready for signatures whenever you are. Congratulations on another visionary move. Sarah smiled as she texted back her thanks. The joint venture, a collaboration between Harrington Innovation Group and Vertex to develop sustainable manufacturing technologies, represented the next phase of her strategic vision. It would create hundreds of new jobs, advance environmental goals she deeply believed in, and position both companies at the forefront of the industry's inevitable shift toward greener production methods. More personally, it symbolized how completely the power dynamic had shifted since her confrontation with Victor. James Lowell, who had once negotiated with her cautiously as Richard's widow, now sought her partnership eagerly, recognizing the value her leadership brought to any venture. The transaction she had orchestrated to protect her position had evolved into a genuine strategic alliance built on mutual respect and shared vision. Inside, as Sarah prepared for bed, she caught sight of her grandmother's watch on her nightstand, a silver timepiece her father had given her at graduation, with its inscription about the value of time. How right he had been. Time was indeed the most valuable thing you could spend, and Sarah had spent hers building something meaningful, not just for herself, but for the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on the companies she led, for the women whose careers her nonprofit initiative had revitalized, for the communities where her businesses operated. In those quiet moments before sleep, Sarah allowed herself to acknowledge a truth she rarely articulated even to herself. Victor's attempt to push her aside had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Without that challenge, without being forced to fight for her place, she might never have fully stepped into her power. She might have remained in the background, influencing through Richard rather than leading directly. The confrontation had been the catalyst that transformed potential into reality. Tomorrow she would return to the work of leadership, the decisions and responsibilities that never ended. But she would do so not as someone with something to prove, but as a leader confidently charting her own course, guided by a vision that honored the past while boldly creating the future. Sarah Mitchell Harrington had long since moved beyond simply defending her inheritance. Now she was building a legacy entirely her own, one that would endure long after Victor's challenge had faded into a footnote in the company's history. As she drifted toward sleep, a final thought surfaced in Sarah's mind. Something Richard had told her during those precious final weeks of his life, when their conversations had reached a depth and honesty beyond anything that came before. The greatest gift we can give each other, he had said, holding her hand with what strength remained to him, is the courage to become fully ourselves. In the end, that was what Sarah had claimed. Not just an inheritance of stocks and titles and corporate authority, but the fundamental right to become fully herself. Leader, visionary, mentor, creator of her own destiny. It was an inheritance no one could ever take away, because it came not from Richard's will or the board's approval, or even her own strategic brilliance. It came from within, the unshakable knowledge of her own worth that had always been there, waiting for the moment when circumstances would call it forth. That moment had come in the confrontation with Victor, but the strength it revealed had been hers all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.